Well, hello. As you can see, I am at work. I just realized that I don't have enough time to make videos when I'm off work. I'm here 12 hours. It's at least a 1 hour commute each way, so 2 more hours going there. Usually I have to do an errand or two, so I'm responsible and have to buy everything for this place. And bottom line is I don't have a lot of time when I'm home, and I don't want to spend it making a video when I could just do it here and get paid to do it, more or less. Anyway, might as well show you around a little bit. It's my workstation. Show you the actual rig. In West Virginia, a lot of mountains everywhere. Those are three very large generators that fill my apartment with glorious noise. Here's the other side. There's a stream and snow. Winter finally came here. Anyway, I'm not the one to make movies just about my work very often. And that's not why I'm making this video. It's just I'm recording. I happen to be at work, so I thought I'd make a video. I hope the sound is okay. If it's not, it's the generators. I'm sorry. I want to do a video on a topic that I can't believe I have not done a video on, and that is Viking Age Iceland and anarcho-capitalism. Now, anybody who starts to study libertarianism seriously and anarcho-capitalism in particular is going to come across the example of sometimes called the Icelandic Commonwealth, the Icelandic Free State. Basically, Iceland before the monarchy of, I guess it was, sorry about that, the alarm went off. Before, it was either the Danish or the Norwegian king took over in the 13th century, I want to say. The period often described in the sagas. And a lot of, people who make the case for a free market society or an anarcho-capitalist society, or at least some form of anarchy, will trot out Iceland, probably more than any other society. Ireland gets brought out there a couple times, and then it's a real Biafran society, maybe the hill peoples of Southeast Asia, certain colonies like Pennsylvania in the 1690s, the Old West, basically anything before a certain date, before the first state, or certainly the areas around. Some people say that the Indus River Valley, but the one example that always is used is Iceland. And for me personally, I had heard of that example, and eventually I saw the movie Pathfinder, which is a terrible movie, actually. It's a horrible movie. But it's about the Vikings in North America, and they actually speak Icelandic in the movie. And at some point, I've always had an ear for that, despite whatever speech impediments I might have. And I learned that, Icelandic is a conservative language that hasn't changed very much over the years. And so, long and short of it, I became interested and actually started learning the language, although I am still really just starting to learn the language, even though it's been a couple of years. I have a decent vocabulary, but I can't put it together for the life of me, except for very simple sentences. So if any of you are Icelandic and want to chat with me, that would be great. And I know some of you already know that, but just in case, I'm throwing it out there. So, for me, it was kind of a personal genesis of interest in linguistics and history and whatnot. But at some point, I decided I really need to analyze, the truth of the statement that Viking Age Iceland was a anarcho-capitalist society. And there's a famous article out there by David D. Friedman, which I think is a good article, and I would I'm just going to say right here that some summary of how it worked and why it eventually failed is accurate, I would say. But he basically, in his paper, has one source that he cites repeatedly. And that's a short little book. Well, not really short. It's maybe 200 or 300 pages. The title of the book is Viking Age Iceland, which I wish I'd have it here and show you to, but it's back at home. And I read it a couple years ago. And Viking Age Iceland is not a book by a libertarian. It's not for libertarians. It's not about libertarianism. It's by an author who, I think he actually lived in Iceland as a child, although he's not Icelandic, and became interested in it, and joined academia, became an Icelandic scholar. And I've actually seen him on television a few times whenever they do shows about the sagas or something like that. They'll show him, and I wouldn't have recognized his name except they put author of Viking Age Iceland. So I've read that book. The covers of it usually have little pictures of ivory figurines, I think, that are probably carved out of narwhal or walrus tusk or something, if anyone's interested. Well, the long and the short of it is, from the founding of Iceland in the 9th century, I think it was founded in the mid-800s, up until the reintroduction, or the introduction rather, of a monarchy. I think it was the Norwegian king in the 13th century. Iceland was without a doubt stateless. That is not an invention of wishful thinking on libertarians' part. That is not only the consensus, but the only conclusion ever drawn by any scholar, and even contemporaries. There are contemporaries who either visited there or know people who did, who mentioned, hey, they don't have a king, they don't have a state. They didn't use terms like state, but... And the next question is, was it a free market? AKA anarcho-capitalism. The answer to that is no. It was mostly a free market. But the one area that wasn't a free market was a system, a social stratification with a certain group of people who are called goar. It's spelled with a funny Icelandic letter, but the spelling in English would be G-O-T-H-A-R-O-R. Again, with the vowels, I don't know. And the translation for the term is kind of, I've seen it as chieftain, as king. But reading the book, I'd have to say the closest thing it is to lawyer. It's not law or lawyer. Lawyer. I second guess myself for the rest of my life because of that. The reason I say that is there's nothing that they could do really that anyone else couldn't, except they could argue a case to the althing. If you needed, you could be your own lawyer, and of course, 1 second, I have business. It's just a report. I probably shouldn't show that to y'all. If you had a dispute with somebody in Iceland, say an argument over a patch of trees or a farmstead or an inheritance or a theft or something, it was legal and conceivable that you could argue that between each other and find your own arbiter. But if you wanted it to be heard in the althing, the highest court in the land, which a lot of times is spoken of as the first parliament or the first democracy, that's kind of a nebulous use. What it really is the highest court of arbitration, the highest court of appeals. If you wanted to be heard in the althing, not just a regular person could go there. You needed to have a goar. And you weren't bound to a goar in the sense that, and this is why they weren't considered a state, because if you didn't like your goar, you could find another one or not have one and do without it. But typically you would kind of form a relationship based on patronage between you and a goar, although that could change over the years. And then if you had a dispute, you could go and have your goar argue on your behalf, and his reason for doing so would be his own prestige, but also if there was a settlement, he would probably be entitled to some of it. I mean, he would literally, you wouldn't pay for it in the same way that we buy goods and services today necessarily, although that could happen. You could say, I'll argue your case if you give me so many goats or sheep or ginger women. Or you could say, just be my friend, and if I ever need your back, I've got yours, that sort of thing. And these Gothers were not states. They did not have the power to legislate their word. They didn't have more authority. The only thing is there was a restriction. There was no free entry in the Gother realm. Now, you could get substitutes. You could arbitrate your own disputes. You could take things into your own hands, too. But Friedman points out in his article about it that this is the crinkle in the free market that allowed the state to come in. Because eventually what happened as the Gothers became able to tax, they weren't entitled to taxation. That's another big difference. They couldn't just go and say, you all owe me. If you didn't like the way he was treating you, you could just say, it's not worth my time and effort to give you anything. And so they typically could not be that abusive of anybody, or most of the people. Now, if they had a vendetta against somebody, they could take it out on that somebody, and they could just hope that acting like a dick to one person wouldn't piss off the rest of their constituents. But if they pissed them all off, or enough of them, they would be out of power. And it wasn't a hereditary thing either. The office of Gother was something that could be bought and sold. So you could say, I don't want to be Gother anymore. If somebody very rich offered you a great deal, you could give it to them. Typically, though, they wouldn't give them to their children, either through patrimony, through the lineage, or maybe through marriage, through a daughter or something. What eventually happened, though, is once Christianity was established in Iceland, you had a number of bishoprics assigned, and basically they collected tithes. And I don't believe it was mandatory to pay the tithe, but what had started to happen is certain Gother became associated with these bishoprics, and they, in fact, some of them may have even become bishops, and then they had access to those revenues. And eventually these tithes became a form of taxation. And the Gother who had control over the bishop, there are some Gothers who had control of bishoprics, and others that did not, which in Icelandic, the word for bishop is biskop. Yeah. The word for abbot is aboti. Tangent. The few who ended up with the bishoprics became much richer and more powerful than the others, and they basically began to struggle with each other for control of the entire island. And this is what caused a lot of chaos and precipitated the invitation of having a monarch introduce his authority into the island. So David D. Friedman, I think, is absolutely correct in his article. The collapse of the Icelandic Free State was not the result of some inherent deficiency in free markets or anarchy. It was the degree to which they didn't have free markets. However, the fact that Iceland is not the perfect example of libertopia is not that big of a deal, because the objection that most statists have to a free society, there are lots of objections, but some of the biggest ones can be addressed and dismissed with the example of medieval Iceland. The most common one, I think the one that's most used, but which is refuted by Iceland, is the idea that you have to have a government for law. That without some central authority dictating legislation and arbitration, for that matter, the two are separate, but they're fused in the eyes of most people. That without that, society is bound to chaos and degeneration and lawlessness. And although there are actually quite a few examples of this, in fact, I would argue that pretty much all law codes, if you trace their roots, have anarchist beginnings, and I would say not just anarchist beginnings, but are pretty well worked out. And at some point, typically a monarch simply codifies something that already existed, and then we end up giving Hammurabi credit for something that had been around a long time. For instance, in Viking Age Iceland, not only was there law, but it was actually a very litigious society. It was a very legal-oriented society. And they had many very nuanced words for legal precedent, like good judgment was called domstol. Law, it means like law chair. There's many. And actually there was a monk from Germany, from Baden, actually, who, I don't know if he visited, I think he visited there, but he wrote that in Iceland there is no king but the law. They didn't have a king, but they had a law, and it was very important. They didn't have a legislative body. The Althing could not tax or pass laws, and yet they were able to have a society that had law, that had order. Much is made that, hey, these are Vikings and they were violent. Yes, there was violence in Iceland, but if you compare it to contemporary Europe, there was practically no violence. I mean, the sagas make for good stories, but we're talking about battles where there are 20 guys on each side, where at the same time in, say, Great Britain or France, you could have thousands and thousands of people killing each other en masse, something that has literally never happened in the entire history of Iceland, state or non-state for that matter, that I'm aware of, but I'm pretty sure that's the case. So there's that. The other thing is Iceland is a pretty inhospitable place. I mean, aside from the guys, it's pretty much a hellhole. There's nothing redeeming about the place. It's just south of the Arctic Circle. It's an island. It snows a lot. It rains a lot. It doesn't get a lot of sun, even when it's in the summer. A lot of glaciers, and there's lots of volcanoes and earthquakes and other pleasant things like that. And as a result, agriculture is pretty difficult. There's only a few crops that can be grown there at all that humans can even eat. Mostly it has to have an economy based on pastoralism and fishing, but fishing isn't great there. The weather is terrible. And yet this society was able to not just eke out a living, but actually do fairly well and develop a relatively, not just relatively, an extremely advanced form of literature. I mean, compares favorably to anything else that was going on in Europe at the time. Even today, it stands pretty well. I mean, I'm not saying I love the sagas or anything, but I'm just saying that these people weren't on the verge of chaos or anything like that. They were in a very tough situation, and they were doing fine, and they didn't have a state coordinating their actions. There was no government saying, this is what we need to do to make sure we survive. That didn't happen at all. Of course, once Iceland did get a state, it proved to be the only thing that could compete with the volcanoes in terms of their destructive ability. Witness the financial collapse in 2008, which is, pretty good idea of how beneficial states have been to the island. So, yes, Iceland was definitely an anarchy. It was definitely showed the viability of law, at least, in a society that lacks a state or any central authority dictating legislation or arbitration. It shows that you can have order and that you can survive in harsh circumstances without this. Now, is it a perfect example? No. It didn't have a totally free market. That's what caused its downfall. Eventually into a subservient colony of eventually the Danes, although not originally. It was the Norwegians, although I guess at this point the distinction between the Danes and the Norwegians is rather perfunctory. Nonetheless, I think it's a good example. Libertarians are not using wishful thinking when they cite it, and it is worthy of research I don't know if you'd have to read the book. I recommend David Friedman's article again. It does summarize, I think, the genesis of what actually happened there very well. And all right, bless.